You have had entire arguments with people who were not in the room. You have rehearsed conversations that never happened. You have solved problems that did not exist yet, and then spent the whole night awake, exhausted from thinking, unable to stop. That is not anxiety. That is not weakness. That is a subconscious program running without your permission, and it has nothing to do with your thoughts. That is the part nobody tells you. Everyone wants to fix your thinking. Meditate more, journal more, think positive, breathe. But the overthinking was never the problem. It was always the signal, and until you understand what it is signaling, you will keep trying to silence something that is trying to speak. Your mind is not broken. It is doing exactly what it was trained to do. And that training did not begin with your conscious decisions. It began long before you had the ability to question it. The subconscious mind does not think in the way you imagine thinking. It does not sit down and reason through your problems. It does not weigh options carefully and arrive at a conclusion. It runs patterns, it detects familiar signals, and activates familiar responses. And if you grew up in an environment where things were uncertain, where silence between people felt heavy, with something unsaid, where being unprepared once meant being embarrassed or dismissed or hurt, then your subconscious learned one thing very early: stay ready. Never stop scanning. And it has been following that instruction ever since, not because something is wrong with you, because something once was. And the mind that protected you then never received the message that things are different now. The rehearsed argument in your head at 2 in the morning is not irrational. It is your subconscious running a simulation it believes will protect you. It is preparing you for a threat that may never arrive. But to the subconscious, preparation feels like survival. And survival is always the priority. This is the paradox that nobody sits with long enough. You are not a person who thinks too much. You are a person whose internal system was taught that thinking more equals staying safe. And so it thinks and thinks and thinks, not because it wants to exhaust you, not because there is something fundamentally wrong with the way your brain is wired, but because it genuinely believes at a very deep level that it is keeping you alive. That exhaustion you feel after a night of overthinking is not a flaw. It is the cost of a protection system that never learned it could rest. Now here is what changes everything. The problem is not the thoughts themselves. The problem is the identity underneath the thoughts. There is a version of you that your subconscious is trying to protect. And that version believes the world is unpredictable and needs to be controlled. That version believes you must always be on guard, always one step ahead, always prepared for the worst. That version believes that if you stop preparing, something will go wrong. And as long as that identity is the operating system, no amount of breathing exercises will stop the loop, because you can calm the surface of water all you want. But if the current underneath is still moving in the same direction, the surface will never stay still for long. Most people who struggle with overthinking have been taught to treat the thoughts directly. They try to challenge their thinking patterns. They try to replace the negative thoughts with positive ones. They try to catch themselves mid-spiral and pull themselves back with logic. And sometimes that helps for a moment, for an hour. But then they are sitting in a car and a song comes on and suddenly they are back inside a conversation from 3 years ago, replaying every word, turning over every silence, wondering what they should have said differently. Not because they forgot to breathe, because the identity underneath never changed. Think of it this way. A musician who has played an instrument for 20 years does not think about where to place their fingers. They do not consciously decide which keys to press or how much pressure to apply. Their hands simply move, because the skill is no longer stored in conscious thought. It lives in the body, in the subconscious, as a deeply ingrained automatic pattern. Overthinking works the same way. You practiced worry for so long, and in so many moments that felt important, that it became automatic. You did not consciously decide to rehearse that argument at 2 in the morning. Your subconscious chose it for you, because that is the pattern it knows. That is the loop it was trained to run. And patterns do not stop running because you want them to. They do not stop running because you intellectually understand they are not helpful. They stop running when the identity underneath them, the self-concept that made them necessary, is no longer the identity you are living from. This is why willpower alone will never solve overthinking. This is why discipline at the level of thought will only take you so far. Because you are not trying to change a habit. You are trying to change a belief about who you are and what the world requires of you. And that is a different kind of work entirely. Here is what most people do when they first realize they are caught in the overthinking loop. They try harder. They add more effort to the trying. They clench tighter around the intention to stop. They monitor every thought. They judge every thought. They try to stop thinking about the thing by thinking very carefully about the thing. And the mind gets louder. Not because they are doing it wrong, because effort applied at the wrong level only adds more weight to the same program. Think of it like someone trying to stop a machine from running by pressing the off button harder. The machine does not care how much force you use. If the power source is still connected, it will keep running. Your thoughts are not the power source. Your identity is, and the identity is not held in your logic, not in your willpower, not in your best intentions. It is held in the part of you that responds before you decide to respond. The part that tightens in your chest before your mind has registered why. The part that already knows how a conversation will go before it has even started. The part that wakes up in the middle of the night already mid-thought, already mid-worry, already mid-loop. That part is where the real work lives, and that is exactly where most advice never reaches, because most advice is given at the level of behavior. Do this, stop doing that, think differently. But behavior is always downstream from identity. What you do is always a reflection of who you believe you are at the deepest level. And the person who believes they must always be prepared, always vigilant, always one step ahead of potential pain, that person will keep overthinking, no matter how many techniques they learn, no matter how much they want to stop, until the belief itself changes. Until the identity itself shifts, and that shift does not happen through more thinking. It happens through something quieter, something most people have never been taught to access, and that is exactly what this is about. Here is something the self-help world almost never says. You cannot tell the subconscious mind to stop, not because it is stubborn, not because you are weak, but because the subconscious does not have a stop function. It was not built to stop. It was built to continue, to maintain, to preserve what it knows. Think about what happens when you remove a piece of furniture from a room you have lived in for years. The chair is gone, but for weeks, sometimes months, you still move around the space where the chair used to be. You still navigate the room as if it is there. Your body remembers the shape of the old arrangement, even after the arrangement has changed. The subconscious works exactly like that. You can remove the thought. You can decide you will no longer worry. You can make the conscious choice to let go, but the subconscious continues to move around the space where the old pattern used to live, because it does not process absence, it only processes presence. This is why the instruction to stop thinking about something almost always makes you think about it more. The moment you say to yourself, "Do not think about this," you have just made that thing the most present object in your inner world. The mind cannot hold a negative command. It can only hold the image, the feeling, the scenario itself. And so the loop continues. Not because you failed to try hard enough, because you were using a tool that was never designed for the job. The subconscious does not respond to resistance. It responds to repetition. It responds to the frequency of what you return to most. And, for most overthinkers, the thing they return to most is the thing they are most afraid of. Not because they want to, because fear has a way of making things feel urgent, and urgency creates repetition, and repetition creates pattern, and pattern becomes identity. So the question is never, "How do I stop this?" The question is always, "What have I been repeatedly returning to?" Now this is where it gets very specific, and this is the part most people skip over, because it requires honesty. Because the overthinking loop always has a center. And that center is never really about the situation you are thinking about. It is about a conclusion you drew about yourself a long time ago. A conclusion that felt so certain, so final in the moment it arrived, that it never got questioned again. There is a moment in almost every person's life where they got something wrong. A test, a conversation, a decision, a relationship. And in that moment, something in them quietly concluded, "This is what I am." Not this is what happened, not this is what I did in this particular moment, but this is what I am. A child who gives one wrong answer in class and gets laughed at does not simply learn that the answer was wrong. If the moment is charged enough, if the shame is strong enough, if the audience is large enough, that child concludes something about their own fundamental nature. I am the kind of person who gets it wrong. I am the kind of person who does not belong here. I am the kind of person who needs to be more careful next time, and more careful becomes always careful, and always careful becomes constant preparation. And constant preparation becomes a mind that cannot rest, and that mind becomes the person who is still rehearsing the conversation at 2 in the morning, decades later, in a completely different life, with completely different people. Because the conclusion never changed. The original moment faded, but the decision made in that moment stayed. It stayed in the subconscious as a core instruction, a fundamental assumption about the kind of person you are and the kind of world you live in. And here is what makes this so invisible and so powerful. The person does not remember the moment. They do not walk around consciously thinking, I am overthinking because of something that happened a long time ago. They simply feel that they must think through everything carefully. They feel that something could go wrong if they are not prepared. They feel underneath everything that they are the kind of person who needs to be very, very careful. And that feeling is not in their conscious mind, where they could examine it. It is in the subconscious. It is woven into their automatic responses, their instinctive reactions, their quiet assumptions about how life works. It is the invisible architecture their every thought is built on top of. This is why understanding the mechanism changes everything, because most people are trying to manage their thoughts while never questioning the conclusion underneath the thoughts. They are adjusting the furniture while the foundation of the house has a crack in it, and no amount of rearranging the surface will stop the crack from spreading. Now here is the part that requires you to sit with something uncomfortable. The subconscious mind is not trying to harm you with the overthinking loop. It is trying to be loyal to you, loyal to the version of you it has known the longest, loyal to the identity it was given the instruction to protect. There is a story of a Japanese soldier named Hiroo Onoda, who continued fighting in the Philippine jungle until 1974, 30 years after the Second World War had ended. Not because he was confused, not because he lacked intelligence, because no one had officially given him the order to stop. He was loyal to the last instruction he had received. He was loyal to the mission and the identity that mission required him to be. Vigilant, prepared, never standing down. Your subconscious is doing the same thing. It received an instruction a long time ago, in a moment that felt like the most important moment in the world. Stay alert, stay ready, stay prepared, because the world is unpredictable, and you are not safe unless you are ready for anything. And no one ever officially gave it the order to stand down. So it continues, not out of malfunction, out of loyalty, out of an unwavering commitment to the mission it was assigned in a moment you may not even remember. And here is why that understanding matters more than any technique. Because if the subconscious is loyal, that loyalty can be redirected. If it is committed, that commitment can be aimed at something new, something chosen, something that reflects who you actually are now, rather than who you had to be then. The subconscious is not your enemy. It never was. It is your most faithful inner servant running instructions that simply no longer belong to you. Instructions written in a moment of fear by a version of you that was smaller, more vulnerable, less equipped than the person you are right now. And the work, the real work, is not to fight that loyalty. It is to give the subconscious a new mission, a new identity to protect, a new story to keep running, because it will keep running something. That is what it does. The only question is what that something will be. And the answer to that question does not begin with effort. It does not begin with discipline or willpower, or trying harder to think better thoughts. It begins with something quieter than all of that. It begins with understanding, clearly and completely, who you have been telling yourself you are, and then making a different decision. 1238, confirmed within the 1200-1300 range. Presenting now. So here is the question that actually matters. If the subconscious responds to identity, how do you change the identity? not with affirmations, not with repetition of words you do not yet believe, not with a list of positive statements read out loud every morning, while a deeper part of you quietly disagrees with every single one. That approach treats the subconscious like a recording device. And it is not. It is a pattern recognition system. And pattern recognition systems do not respond to what you say. They respond to what you assume. There is a difference between hoping something is true and assuming something is true. Hope lives at the surface. It has a question mark behind it. It contains, inside its very structure, the possibility of the opposite. Assumption lives in the subconscious. It has no question mark. It does not entertain the opposite because it does not need to. It simply operates from what it takes to be already settled. Think about the way a skilled actor inhabits a role. Not a beginner trying to remember their lines and hit their marks. A deeply experienced actor who has lived inside a character long enough that the character begins to move through them naturally. They do not try to feel like the character. They do not remind themselves every few minutes who they are playing. They simply assume the character's way of seeing the world, the character's posture, their silence, their relationship to the room they walk into, and the performance becomes effortless, not because they are pretending harder, but because at a functional interior level they have temporarily become. This is the mechanism the subconscious responds to. Not performance, not effort, not hope, assumption. The quiet, settled, interior sense that something is already true. And this is where the shift in overthinking actually begins. Not in the thoughts, not in the behavior, in the assumed identity. When you stop operating from the identity of someone who must always be prepared for the worst, and begin operating from the identity of someone who is fundamentally safe, the subconscious receives a new signal. Not a signal of hope, not a signal of effort, a signal of settled interior truth. And it begins, slowly at first, then completely, to reorganize around that new signal. The loop quiets. Not because you forced it to stop, because the thing that was. Running the loop is no longer the thing you are living from. Now here is something most people miss entirely. This shift does not happen at the level of thought. It happens below thought. It happens in the body, in the nervous system, in the felt sense of who you are when no one is watching and nothing is required of you. Think about the moment someone receives news that changes everything in an instant. Not bad news or good news specifically, just news that is completely final and certain. A result, a decision, a confirmation of something that was always going to be true. In that moment, the body shifts before the mind catches up. The shoulders drop or rise, the breath changes, something in the chest releases or tightens, depending entirely on the nature of the news, before a single conscious thought has been completed. That physical response is the subconscious receiving information and updating its model of reality. And that is the level where identity change actually lives. Not in a thought you think, in a shift you feel, in a release that happens somewhere below, your reasoning, in the quiet interior place where your body keeps track of who you believe yourself to be. This is why the person who tries to think their way into a calmer identity always finds it slipping away by evening, because they are working at the wrong level. They are arranging thoughts about safety while the body is still vibrating with the old frequency of threat. The real shift happens when the nervous system itself receives a new and different instruction, when something in the interior finally settles, not because you convinced yourself, because you assumed yourself, because you dropped, even for a moment, into the felt sense of a person who is already okay, already safe, already whole, not trying to get there, already there. And this requires something unusual. It requires you to stop fixing. Most people approach the overthinking problem as something to be repaired, as evidence that something in them is broken or insufficient or not yet developed enough. And that framing, that quiet assumption of brokenness, is itself the program continuing to run. It is the original wound restating itself in the language of self-improvement. I am someone who needs to be fixed. I am someone who is not yet okay. And as long as that is the operating assumption underneath everything else, the subconscious will continue to generate experiences that confirm it, not out of cruelty, out of loyalty. It will keep finding evidence that you are someone in need of repair. Because that is the identity it has been asked to maintain. The overthinker does not need more tools. They need a different premise entirely. Not I am broken and I am working to heal, but I am already whole and I am simply remembering that. The quiet mind is not something you build. It is something you return to. It was there before the fear arrived. It was there before the moment that first taught you the world was unsafe. It was there before the conclusion was made and written into the subconscious as law. Underneath every layer of noise, underneath every rehearsed argument and imagined disaster, there is a stillness that has always been yours. It did not go anywhere. It was simply buried under a program that ran loud enough and long enough to make you forget it existed. And what you are doing right now, in understanding all of this, is not adding something new to yourself. You are removing the assumption that you were ever without it. The person you are becoming is not a future version of you. They are the version that was always underneath, the one who does not need to rehearse every conversation because they trust themselves to show up, the one who does not need to solve every imagined problem in advance because they know they can handle what actually arrives, the one who moves through the world with a quietness that is not emptiness, that is groundedness, that is presence, that is the subconscious finally operating from an identity that is at peace with itself, and it does not take years to arrive there. It takes a decision, not the decision to think differently, the decision to be differently, to assume from this moment forward the identity of someone who is already safe, already enough, already the kind of person the world does not need to be rehearsed for. That assumption, held not as a wish but as a settled interior truth, is the signal the subconscious has been waiting for. And once it receives it, the loop does not just slow down. It loses its reason to exist, because the identity that created it is no longer the one running. And something else begins, not with effort, not with noise, with silence. The silence that was always there, waiting for you to remember it, waiting for you to come home.